Hello, 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 and good morning. I'm Justin Coletti from SonicScoop. Thank you for coming to MixCon. You have joined us for, I think this is going to be one of my favorite presentations of the weekend because Mike Major is one of my favorite writers for SonicScoop. He's also an amazing engineer and producer in his own right. He's worked with some tremendous indie rock and alternative rock bands like At the Drive-In, Coheed and Cambria, As Tall as Lions, and so many more. And he does really, really good work. And he's so methodical. He's one of those people, these rare breeds. He's been doing this for 30 years. He's good at doing it, but he's also good at communicating and describing what he does. And he goes into tremendous detail. And he's going to do that today. With the time we have available, he's not even going to be able to get through an entire mix. Instead, he's diving deep into one of the things that is most interesting to him and most interesting to so many mixers working in rock music, which is drums. How to get your drums to sit right. And I think some of the principles he's going to talk about today apply not only to rock, but pretty much any medium where you're using real recorded drums and want to get them to sound as good as possible without relying on samples too heavily. I think he's a master at that and a master in his craft. Mike also, these days, he's a big evangelist of acoustic treatment, and he's also a room designer these days at GIK Acoustics, helping people kind of sort out their rooms. And like me, he's got a big spot in his heart for getting your room right. Man, as much as I love great speakers, I would rather have a great sounding room with good speakers than a bad sounding room with great speakers. There's just no question about it. Last but not least, Mike is, like I said, tremendous educator on this stuff. If you want to go even deeper, he has a full-length course that you can get at mixingdrums.com where he goes into even more depth than the time that we have allotted today. But I think you can get a lot out of this one. So let's give a big warm welcome to Mr. Mike Major. As Mike is getting himself situated up there, I also want to give a big shout out to the sponsors for this presentation. Without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to make MixCon 100% free to the public for all these main stage presentations. And the sponsor for this one is one that makes a lot of sense for Mike because he uses their stuff literally every day that he's working, and that is Steinberg, the makers of Nuendo, which is Mike's DAW of choice. So big round of applause for Steinberg, please. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about why he landed on Nuendo, but mostly we're really going to focus on the process for mixing drums, particularly in the idiom of rock, but really across all genres. Thanks again. One more round of applause. Mr. Mike Major, take it away.
How y'all doing? Thanks for having me, Justin. So I'll start off with just a little bit about kind of how I came to this. Started off in the live sound world, actually started off as a drummer and then went to the live sound world and kind of worked my way into recording. I was fortunate to do both simultaneously for about 20 years and found that there were a lot of things to learn from each different discipline that I could apply to the other. I would find things you notice in live shows that you'd sit down in the studio and go, oh man, I could really use that, and then vice versa when you're in the live show and you kind of have to do things at a moment's notice. All the things you figured out when you're sitting in your comfy chair in the studio, you could apply to the live show and make it that much better. The one thing that led me to my process with the drums, and I'm going to try and go into as much detail as possible, is back in the days when we finally started using digital crossovers and drive systems in our PA systems, you know, we were able to, without putting a delay line in it, we could delay the PA system to match the sound coming from the back of the stage, to the back line. And what I found was, if we had a drum kit that was blaring away at the back of the stage with a huge drum fill behind it, and then you turn the PA on, the PA would overpower it, but there was always this kind of incoherence about it. And so we found if we would just delay the PA back to that time arrival time, or what was coming from the back of the stage, all of a sudden everything sounded really clean and coherent, and it took half as much EQ. And so I thought, I could apply that to the drum kit as a whole. The only way to get really, truly phase-coherent drums is to use one microphone. And that's great, except it sounds like one microphone. In some genres, that's perfectly fine, but when you're doing big, loud rock stuff, which I'm probably more apt to do, it just doesn't carry the weight. It doesn't, you know, take up the space that it needs to against the drums and the bass, and the guitars and the bass and the vocals. So, to me, the idea is to somehow approach that phase coherence of one microphone with a whole bunch of microphones. And then there's another skew to that, the fact that I was a drummer for a long time, and there's something about sitting at a drum kit, the certain power, that's what I'm ultimately shooting for. You know, again, with my ears, everything is phase coherent at the drum kit because I've only got one set. So again, to me, it was being able to think about however many mics there are in the kit, if it's 6, if it's 8, if it's 12, if it's 30, you want them all working together. And so it got me thinking about what can I do in a DAW that would allow me to make that as close to a reality as possible. Again, the concept is more about it's not trying to shirk my responsibilities as a mixer as much as it is about trying to do as little as possible, because I think the less I do, the better it sounds in the end. It's kind of like when I went from, you know, recording with cheaper mics to recording with better mics. It's like it just sounded better from the beginning, so you had to do a lot less. And it always sounded better when the time you were done. So same kind of concept. You know, basically, I started playing around with just shifting tracks. And, you know, every DAW has this. I use Nuendo, and actually, before I move on, I can just tell you, Nuendo was something that kind of came about by, I guess, a little bit by chance, but, you know, I came from the analog world originally. You know, I started recording in like '87, and you had tape, that was it. There was no other choice. So when it came time to, you know, really I was a little late to the party, but, you know, around the 2000s when everybody was doing stuff digitally, the studio I was running, we ended up getting a pair of the IS radars, which were wonderful. It was a great transition from tape to digital because it behaved a little more like a tape machine. It had, you know, your arming tracks and simple, you know, punch, and you could do simple edits and everything. But basically, it was like a tape machine. So then, you know, I started thinking, well, people are asking me to do more and more things that I can't do easily. You know, you could do cut, copy, paste, and if you were clever, you figured out ways to slide tracks and things like that. But, you know, with the radar, it was really designed as a tracking thing and just a good sounding, stable system. So when I started looking at DAWs, this was, again, you know, like I said, early 2000s, and I had worked on Pro Tools a few times. And while I appreciated the functionality and what we were capable of doing, I just didn't like the sound. And Pro Tools was very locked into, you know, you had to have, you know, at the time, Digidesign hardware only. And I had 48 channels of radar conversion that sounded great, and I thought, well, what DAW could I use that would allow me to do that? And Nuendo was the one, so we got Nuendo. And I just barely scratched the surface with it at the studio, because again, I had a console, I had outboard, I had everything I needed that I didn't really need to exploit the capabilities that Nuendo had, but I started doing a little bit more editing. Then I left, you know, moved to a new city and started working at home, and I was like, well, I guess I'm going to be mixing, then I'm going to be mixing in Nuendo, and that's all I used until about, I guess, 2012. Then I used Pro Tools for probably about 5-6 years because there was a project right at that time that they were working in LA, and we were going to be transferring stuff back and forth a lot, and they were using Pro Tools, so I went over to Pro Tools. Well, opportunity came up really through SonicScoop that I was able to get a copy of Nuendo 8 to review, and I was hooked again. You know, it was just like, oh, okay, that's right, I really love this. So I was back to Nuendo. Now I've got a copy of 10, and I didn't think it could be that much better, but it was kind of dramatically better. You know, I thought 8 was pretty damn good, and 10 is considerably better. Without getting too much into all the detail of that, because that's not really the focus of what I'm going to be talking about here, it's just that I just love the fact that it's completely customizable. I can make it kind of look the way I want it to look. I like the way it handles tracks. It's got a pretty amazing amount of included plugins that are quite exceptional, though I'm guilty of using everything else. But if I had to mix entirely with their plugins, I'd probably be okay with it. I'm just kind of a plugin glutton, you know. I've got quite a bit. Anyway, so yeah, so Nuendo's kind of become my thing. Getting back to the original thing. So this song is a song called Dirty Laundry by a band called Madus. They're from Los Angeles. And when I was thinking about doing this, you know, when Justin offered it to me, the idea of I didn't want to get a song that was like too great, because I thought that wasn't really representative of what a lot of people would be doing. And I don't mean like it's not the song, it's just these guys didn't spend a ton of money tracking it. They went to a real studio and did the drums in LA. I think it's called Big Bad Sound. Really good job tracking the drums. But then they recorded everything else at home. And it's two guys, they did everything. But I thought instead of getting some really seasoned bunch of guys and showing you these really slick tracks that were recorded, you know, at a really expensive studio, that really wouldn't be as meaningful as maybe what you might be doing yourself at home. So the band's called Madus, the song's called Dirty Laundry. I'll just play a little bit of it just so you can kind of get an idea. And I took my massive session and I shrunk it down, so I bounced the bass guitar and vocal stems because I had 100 faders here, and I didn't think that was pertinent to what we were doing here. I mostly focused on the drums. But I'll just play a little bit of it so you can get an idea of what kind of song it is. Then I'm going to start going through the drums a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about.
I guess you win. Gotta admit, though I do love my LA, some of the overstated narcissism sure could change. Come take a hold while status quo's the ever sweet escape and fit the mold of any place that I shall concentrate. Ooh, you got the guns for hire. Ooh, and all the right attire, but late at night I can hear you crying. Something in your eyes tells me that you're dying. Late at night I can hear you cry. Something in your eyes tells me that you've died. Once was this time while stuck in line for a life.
Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea. It's very raw, just, you know, just a band, right? I think I tend to attract more bands that just kind of want to sound like a band, you know. I'm not much of a big hype guy. I practically never use samples. I think it's, it sounds silly, but it's dishonest, right? I think if the band took the time to record it, then it's my job to present it as they recorded it. I'm supposed to take their vision and bring it forward in the best light. So anyway, that's what I did with these guys. You know, again, they did a good job tracking the drums in that they gave me a whole bunch of stuff, you know, kick in, kick out, snare top, actually two snare top mics, a 57 and a Neumann 84, a snare bottom mic. I've got extras in there, which I'll go over. Hi-hat, two tom mics, overheads, two sets of room mics, and then a mono room mic. And I will say something, because it just popped in my head. They gave me a hi-hat mic, and I'm constantly given tracks that people don't mic the hi-hat, because the idea is that, oh, hi-hat gets everywhere, we don't need this. If you're sending something to somebody, please mic the hi-hat, because the balance you're listening to when you're tracking is not the final balance. And you haven't done a lot of the things that someone who may mix it for you later is going to do. And I can't count how many times I get overheads that have really no hi-hat in them. And so once you start putting gates on stuff and isolating things a little bit more, hi-hat's gone. And so I'm stuck with, I either have too much crash cymbal and just enough hi-hat, or not enough hi-hat and just the right amount of crash cymbals or something like that. So it's one of those things. You don't have to use it. They may never use it, but it's a good safety measure because you just don't know what the final balance is going to be. And too often, even just with going through and fixing tracks and getting stuff in time and in phase, everything shifts. The tone shifts, the balance shifts. And so I think it's better to cover your ass if you can, you know. In some cases, people are just limited on the number of inputs they have, so I get it. If there's anything I was going to lose, it would be a hi-hat mic, absolutely first. But if you got the ability to track everything, and definitely throw a hi-hat mic up there. So basically, let me get to just the drums for a second, because I want to show you where we ended up, and then we're going to kind of go backwards here. I can these babies. Okay, so this is just drums. Okay, so I'm going to flip back in a second to the original drum tracks, and this is just as they came off, untreated, un-EQ'd. I just did kind of a rough balance back in my studio just to kind of show you where it changed. I'll flip over in the middle here. So this is good drums, right? So that's the raw tracks. And then back to the raw tracks. Okay, so obviously, you know, there's more ambience, there's a little more size, a little more impact to the final ones. To me, there's always something appealing about the dry drums. And these guys are pretty cool. I've mixed a bunch of stuff for these guys, and they oftentimes really don't want any reverb on anything. I think I used a tiny bit on this one, but mostly it's just the tracks. And they dig that. As a matter of fact, sometimes I don't even use the room mics because they want it that dry. But let me give you an example of the difference between just the dry drums, and then I'm going to flip it over to what happens after I've shifted tracks around a little bit. And it may not be as dramatic in here. System sounds good, room sounds pretty good, but it may not be quite as obvious as it would be if you're listening to this on monitor. So if you end up watching the video later, it may be a little more dramatic. But anyway. So this is the original drums. So all that is the drums have been shifted. Different drums, different amounts. Back to original. Nothing else is different. Original. Flip. To me, what happens is, and again, this is more, it's a phase and timing issue, that when everything was like it was, even though they did a good job tracking, to me it felt like everything gets a little flatter and shallower. Like I just don't hear as deep anymore. Snare drum gets a little smaller. Again, it feels like I want to EQ it more, and then when I slip them, I feel like maybe I don't need to do that much after all because it's all there. So when I start the process, generally, I'll throw up a rough just to hear everything, because and really I do this with the full mix. I'll throw everything up because I want to hear everything. I want to know how it all fits together, and I just want to get an idea of what's fitting, what's not fitting. You kind of make all your mental notes. Then I just bring all the faders down and start over. The drums, I will start with just the kick and snare, and depending on what kind of shape the tracks are in, I may EQ them right away, and there's other times that I wait to EQ them until I've done a little more of the shifting. But I think if you end up adopting anything like this, I think it's best to hold off on the EQ until you've got everything in time, because it really is going to change things a lot. Because I've been doing it this way for so many years, I can kind of see a little bit further down the road about, I know that I'm going to need more out of this or out of that. But again, if you don't EQ until later, at least you know what's been fixed. And again, even the EQ sounds will change because the phase relationship between all these different microphones. You know, all that's doing is like notching certain frequencies and boosting other frequencies as you shift things around. So if I was to start, you know, say with just the kick, this is the final track. So I'm going to go ahead and bypass some plugins here. Outside. So if I start with just the kick, and I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to work on the timing between the kick and the snare. I'm sorry, between the kick inside and the kick outside mic. Okay, so if I just listen to the kick, and it's a pretty, you can tell that mic's way inside the drum. You know, it's right in there. And it's cool, because they had this to add to it, outside. Now, if I do the same thing, and I go back to the original tracks, so on Nuendo, and you can see up here in the upper corner, I'm going to show my display on the timeline to be samples, because since we're shifting stuff, we want to get to the finest resolution possible. Samples is about as fine as you can get. If you notice, in this upper corner, up here, where my mouse is, that shows the start point of this particular track. And you see it says 48. So it's this track starts at 48 samples. And this was something that I determined, back home. And so same thing with the outside mic, which isn't always true. Sometimes the inside and the outside end up in different positions. Snare drum's at 0. Snare top 2, I ended up adding 2 samples to it. And I'm going to show you why. Snare bottom, 0. Snare hat, 60 samples. Tom 1, 130 samples. Tom 2, 170 samples. Overhead left and right both ended up at 180 samples. 270 samples on room left and room right. 230 samples on other room left and other room right. And then mono is at 60 samples. Now, none of this was arbitrary. And I try not to do it visually. I think it's easy to get everything to line up and look right, but that doesn't always mean that that's the best place for it. Sometimes it is. When it comes to overheads, I might do that because the timing difference between the two mics and the snare is such that it won't give you as strong a center image. So I may start with it visually, but I always do an audible check because you just never know, And I'll just nudge it a sample at a time until it does what I want it to. Like I said, I try my best not to go into it with preconceptions like, well, the kick is going to be 0 and then I'm going to add from that. Because I don't know. I don't know, and I'm going to find out on every track. So if we start with kick, let's just say, for example, if I take this one and I want to nudge the kick outside versus the kick inside. I'm going to put I don't know if you guys, you can see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to change this to 1 sample resolution. So as I nudge, it's just going to shift it 1 sample at a time, right? Ugh. Oh, terrible, terrible, right? So let's do this again. 10 samples, 20 samples. That's how much it's changing. It starts getting nasty, right? And all I've done is shift it. And it's kind of crazy how different that is. So now let's add the snare. This is just the snare top mic. It's at 0. If I take the snare and I push it to like 48, like I did on the original, it just didn't feel right. It felt small and thin and a little bit pinched, I guess would be the best way to say it. It's very meticulous and it takes a long time, but it's totally worth it. And with the snare top 2, like I said, I think I had 2 samples on that, right? Yeah. So this one was much less obvious, but when you're getting into these little 1 and 2 sample shifts, it's more about the top end because you're thinking about tiny little wavelengths at 1 sample. So right now I'm back at 2, so let's go to 0. So this is both mics at the same timing. 1 sample. Just like right there, all of a sudden the top end just gets much clearer. Yeah, you can just hear like the top end opens up on it. And again, I see this on guitar amps too, when people double mic a guitar amp, that you can just shift one of them 1 sample, and it's just like, oh, there it is. It's there. Oftentimes when people do the 2 snare mic, I've seen people do the 57 and the 84, and they just tape them together. So, but even that, if the capsules aren't exactly aligned, and even if they are exactly aligned, that doesn't mean that that's the best position. Just because they're physically in time doesn't mean that EQ-wise, that's the best place for it to be. So snare bottom, again, I was at 0, and we can play around with it. I don't use a ton of snare bottom typically, but it's in there. So let's shift that one a little bit. That in the monitor here, it sounds worse. That's only 15, 16 samples. And that just feels like it kind of messed with the bottom end of it when I pushed it that far over. Okay, so now let's take the kick and snare and play with them against each other. So we're going to be moving more than one track at a time, because this is one of those things that, like, for example, I have the snare at 0, basically, so let's play around with shifting the kick further away and closer, right? And let's do bigger jumps, say 10 samples. You can hear it's not even how much it affects the kick, it's what's happening to the snare. It just completely changes. Yeah, it's like all the body and the snare just seems to disappear when I shift this later. Now again, you can use this kind of phase manipulation to your benefit if that's what you're trying to do. If you're trying to thin things out without resorting to EQ or other methods, sometimes just shifting the phase around can give you this really bizarre, maybe not linear, but something is exactly what you're looking for. Once I do the kick and the snare and I get them working, then I go to the overheads. To me, the overheads are a really big deal on a drum kit. I've always done it to where they're not just cymbal mics, they're kind of everything mics. And I want the overheads to sound good by themselves. It's not going to be a perfect picture, but I do want all the body. I do want cymbals, obviously, but and I want a bit of a spread. I want to hear the toms and everything. So if I get those right first, you make sure that they're good left to right. Time alignment of those is good left to right, and then you add them into the kick and snare. And when a track is not done right, as soon as you bring the overheads up, everything changes. Then you've got a phase problem, because it happens a lot. You push it up, and snare maybe gets, it's like you heard this kind of boom, boom, boom thing, and then all of a sudden it gets real thin and hard sounding. It's like, well, you could probably have a phase problem between the snare and the overheads. It could be flipped with reversing the polarity, or fixed with reversing the polarity, but I kind of prefer to do both. And I also use the Little Labs thing, which I'll show you that in a little bit too. The in-between phase box. The next thing I would do is go to the overheads. The room mics. We're going to do the same thing. In this case, there's 2 pairs. Cole's 4038s of the room, which are beautiful. And I have those, how far? 270, my bad. I have found, there's been times that with the room mics, I'll end up 300, 400, 500 samples later. And you can get away with it depending on what you do with the room mics. If you got a lot of top end in there, you might start to notice some flamming. But if you don't have a lot of top end in there, kind of doesn't matter, because that low mid-range stuff will just all mesh together, and it just makes the whole kit sound large. So I go through this. I'll go through it with the room mics. I'll go through it with the mono room. And the idea, I usually listen to everything close to a real balance, but I might exaggerate some things like the room mics, because I want to know if I push them, it still fits. But if I choose not to use them much, it's not being destructive. That's the main thing. You want to make sure that no matter what mixing decision you make, everything is working together. Everything is phase coherent. It's a process. And I do the same with the hi-hat, do the same with the toms. If there's a ride mic, the hi-hat would be, I'd probably put the overheads up and then listen for the hi-hat and the overheads, and then fade it in to where I can hear it, and then shift the timing until it sits where it's supposed to in the over. You can actually make it feel like it goes from left to right just by the timing. So I can't stress enough how important it is to have a good environment to listen to this, because it's not always dramatic on headphones. It's definitely not dramatic in a bad sounding room. But if you know your room and you trust your room, these things, it's so obvious. And like Justin said, I work at GIK Acoustics. I'm a room designer there, so acoustics are a big deal to me. And I've worked hard to get my room as accurate as possible just for that reason. It's not like, I just want to tell people I have a great sounding room. I want it to be easy to work in. That's the main thing. Some of this may not seem as dramatic if you're working in a room that's hard to hear in, but anything you can do to kind of get that, is definitely gonna make it easier for you to kind of fully appreciate the kind of changes you can make with this kind of stuff. Now let me go back to some of the EQ and stuff like that we did on the actual drum tracks here. Okay, so we're going to start back with the kick. To me, it's cool that it's right in there, but it's really bright. Usually against big, loud guitars, that's kind of welcome, because it'll poke out a bit. But when I notice that it's that bright and that EQ'd in the midst of it, then that's too bright for me. So I throw in this Elysia EQ. So I took a lot of that point off of it. You know, it's like somewhere around, where is that? Yeah, 5200. Just doing a tiny bit of mid-range cut at 700, but that's it. It's just two things. And then I go to the kick outside mic, which has its own thing. And you can hear it's got this low mid, this low end. It's got some hang to it too, so you can hear that front head resonating now. I usually do a touch of compression on that, not much. You can barely, it's like every now and then you see the meter move here, because I just want to catch the loud transients just to make that, it's a slightly slower attack, so then it grabs the release and, you know, makes it a little bit longer. And then my favorite, the Little Labs IBP. I don't know if you guys use this or if you've ever used it, but they're voodoo, man. It's crazy how cool it is. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. You can only hear it. I'm going to bypass, this is bypassed right now. So you got this or that. Now, the thing about the Little Labs IBP, it takes all the stuff that I was doing and goes even further, because you've got your delay adjustment, which I'll fine tune it with this. And then you've got a phase adjustment where you can actually, it does phase rotation anywhere from 0 to 360 degrees. You can set where the center of that phase rotation is either low or high. But as you shift it around, and I'll show you what that sounds like. You can get that very kind of heavy, almost like metal kick, just by taking all that mid-range out right there. It's not EQ, it's just phase. All I'm doing is varying the phase of that outside kick relative to the inside kick. With this track, I really wanted that low-mid forcefulness, I guess. And you know, it's got a phase invert. Yeah, that's even more extreme, right? Because the inside mic was so bright and so, you know, pointed, and I love the outside mic that has that roundness, I still felt like it needed a little more of a push somewhere. So I used this, what I called a woof mic, and it was to kind of give me, as I can see here, it's somewhere, where is it? Yeah, 72 hertz, you know, just not like I was like, oh, it's got to be at 72 hertz. No, I just kind of played around until I found what I wanted. But what this mic does is it gives this kind of, here, I'll show you. So you can see, I've filtered out all the top end. I've got the high pass filter at 57, because I don't want to add more super low rumble. I'm just trying to give it this little bump at like 72. And then I've got some compression. Again, it's the same thing, to make that transient of it stick out, and then it grabs and it pulls it back down again. So it gives me a little bit of shape to the way the decay is. But you can hear the difference if I go. That's without. With it. So it just, to me, it just pushes it forward a little bit more. It kind of makes it, when I finally put it up against the bass guitar and everything, it's going to have a lot more to it. So another thing that I do, and I'll give you all a quick explanation of the rest of my kind of drum process. I have a fairly convoluted way of doing it that is born out of processes that I just kept developing as I kept doing it, and you'd get to a point where I'm not happy with the drums unless I do all this stuff, and I was like, I wish I could just throw it up and just EQ and be done, and I just can't do it anymore. It's kind of it's like a sickness. So I take my kick, my 3 kick mics, and over here I have my kick group. So I route all 3 of those to my kick group. Snare, I've got snare top, snare top 2. I have one called snare bright. So that's, I take the snare and I just make it really bright and I do some compression on it. So I have a fader on which I can add brightness, basically. Then I've got one called snare deep. Same thing except on the other side. I find a resonant peak on the drum, and now I can affect how deep the drum sounds, basically. It just adds like a fatness control. I'm going to show you that in a second. And then the snare bottom. And all of those are bused to my snare group. And then I've got a bunch of processing on each group. So I try and temper what I do on the individual tracks because I know I'm going to do more stuff on the groups. You know, so for example, let's go back to that kick. I'm going to start with this, all that bypassed. I mean, this is my kick without my group processing. And then that's with all the group processing. So it's, you know, it's not small. I'm doing quite a bit there. We got the tape emulation and let's see. Oh yeah, then the Slate console emulation there. I have all the drums running through a console emulation. I generally like that. I think it sounds better. And then the Pultec Pro. I could use 2 separate Pultecs from the UAD stuff, but I like the fact that this is all in one plugin. Even though the newer UADs sound better, I've kind of gotten addicted to the convenience of just having it all there. I'm doing that typical Pultec boost and cut thing, and I'll show you that a little more in a second. And then a transient designer. And this, especially when you're mixing really loud stuff and inevitably there's going to be compression across everything, low-end decay gets really, really important. What I find is by the time I get everything in phase and everything working together, sometimes the low end just is too much now. And you know, I rarely do much boosting in the low end because there's so much there. I mean, it's just natural. It's natural to the drum. But this gives me the ability to leave the low end as big as I want, but then be able to shut that decay down so it doesn't get messy. You know, there are times that I'll have to sustain like -9, -10, significant amounts, depends on the way it was tracked. I mean, it's almost like gating it. But in this track, again, I think I wanted something with a little more hang to it. But you can also go crazy in the other direction, you know? Where it's just out of control, right? And also all the room ambience comes up with it. And you can even go the other way, same thing with the attack. I could make this more attack. I was fortunate that the studio I ran, we had 2 of these hardware version things, and I kind of found them to be indispensable on drums anyway. Okay, so kick and snare go to their kick and snare groups, right? And then I have several drum buses over here. I have what I call my drum P-comp, parallel comp bus. I have my drum comped bus, and then I have my all drum bus. The kick and the snare and the toms are all going to go straight to the drum comped bus, but they're also going to feed a parallel comp bus. So they're all routing to this one compressor, but they're getting parallel compressed as well and combined, and then they go to the all drum bus. The hi-hats, the cymbals, and the room, I want all of those to just go to the all bus because I don't want those to be compressed at all. And some of that is just because I really hate what compression does to cymbals. Cymbals have a very natural decay, and once you get a compressor on them, that goes away. And having been a drummer, it bothers the hell out of me, and not to mention, it makes things a mess, you know? If I really felt like compressing overheads, which I don't know that I've ever compressed overheads, but if I felt like it, I would rather do it on the mics and have infinite control just of that particular thing. The amount of compression that I use is never a lot of parallel compression, but not the rest of it. And, you know, again, I just don't want to all of a sudden hear a cymbal go and just kind of swell up afterwards, because to me it's like, it's obvious I did something wrong, you know? So with the kick and snare, you know, they're going over to the parallel compressed bus. I'm going to show you what that's all about too. So, yeah, let's just solo up kick and snare, and I want to show you how dramatic the parallel compression is. I'm going to mute the parallel, and again, it's not just a volume thing. You're going to hear a big difference in the tone, but so that's just going to my main drum bus. But then I've got this amazing thing, the Zener limiter from Chandler. This thing is absurdly cool. I'm going to put that in. So you can hear just the amount of impact and stuff it adds is just absurd. Try and ignore the volume part. So like I said, all of this is all routing right here through the drum comp bus on the way to the all bus. I'm doing a tiny bit of compression on the drum comp bus, but you'll see how much I'm talking about here. Barely any. But I have found with this, the VSE2, the Vertigo, which is kind of an SSL style comp with, I think, a little more hi-fi sounding, it's got a way of kind of making transients pop in a cool way. So that's generally what I use over there. There's a few others I'll use from time to time. And then, before I go to the all bus, I put a limiter on all of it. And it's barely doing anything. But it's there for those occasional transients that will jump through. And this was, I was chastised by a mastering engineer friend years ago who was, you know, I'm guilty of mixing a snare drum way too loud. I know it, you know. It's fine, whatever. But he said, you know, if you could do something to at least grab the transients, then it's not going to cause my master limiter to do funny things when I master. And I thought, he's right. You know, he's right. I should absolutely do something about this. So I started putting a limiter on that so I can get my average level where I want and know that no transient is going to cause a problem somewhere downstream. Because I do my best to maximize the gain structure through the entire console. I'm kind of old school in that, you know, back when it used to be, if you didn't get your gain structure set right on a console, you couldn't just bring the master fader down to fix it because it was overloading the summing amps. If you didn't get your gain structure right, you were screwed, and you had to go and bring individual tracks down. Well, I try and set my console up in such a way that there's never any clipping anywhere as if I'm in the analog domain. I think it makes the plugins run a little better, a little more like I expect them to. But again, it's just kind of a weird obsession of mine anyway. Getting back to the limiter, I do the same thing on the snare group because same kind of thing. I'm trying to catch that transient, and again, you can see it's doing very little. Every now and then, if I drop this down, see, you'll see it's grabbing one every now and then. I don't want it to change the sound of the drum. I just want it to catch those loud peaks. When the drummer gets crazy and he just gets one large hit, I don't want it to cause everything else to go crazy, including the bus compressor. Getting back to my snare processing, I do the same thing. I got my tape emulation, which I drive a little harder just to get... Again, you can see I'm old school because there's headroom on the tape. I'm not running this to drive the tape into compression. I'm running this to get just the sound of tape because I always liked the way it sounded. Got my virtual mix you know, console thing. This cool thing, the AMEC 9098 emulation on the snare group. Transient Designer, my best friend. And then the limiter, which is doing almost nothing. See, and you can see it just grabs every now and then, and to me, it's a safety net. It's really what it's there for. I just want to, when I set the snare level, I just want to know I'm in good shape all the way down to the main left-right. And then on the entire drum mix, so I've got my hi-hats, my rooms, all that stuff going to the entire drum mix, and I'll put an EQ on the whole thing. And this goes back a little bit to some of my live sound training, some of my mastering. I've done a lot of mastering. I find if I do good EQ on the whole thing with a really high quality EQ, I'm probably going to do a lot less EQ on all the individual channels. So if I'm feeling like I need to brighten the snare up and maybe I need to brighten the overheads up, maybe the toms need to be brighter, just brighten everything up. And I'd rather do it with a really good EQ that's more transparent and that, like this SPL, you know, the pass EQ is amazingly big sounding, and you can do pretty good boost in the top end and it never gets nasty sounding. And same thing, I'm kind of doing a little shaping down here in the low mid. This doesn't look like much. I think it's like 1/3 of a dB, but on this thing, that's really noticeable. It's kind of surprisingly noticeable. The overheads, again, the time alignment thing, right? We get them stereo, but then I use a Little Labs, same thing, because it's really hard to get your overheads placed exactly right and get everything be phase coherent. And I just find that oftentimes it's just a tiny little phase shift that will make them just sound a little, sometimes it makes them bigger, sometimes it makes them wider, sometimes it reinforces the snare, sometimes it gives more space for the snare. It really depends on the track. But in this case, I remember this being really subtle. Yeah, you can hear like a very slight change in the low mid-range when I put it in. But again, this is one of those things that you can ruin it just by going. See, it gets like out of phase in the middle there. Like even in these monitors, I can hear it got wide, you know. I didn't know it was stereo. That's cool. So if I shift this around, I can completely change the width of it. I can make it sound hollow in the middle. I can make it sound coherent in the middle. But you only do it on one side. And you should really, when you're setting it, you should do it with the kick and the snare up, because making the overhead sound right is one thing, but I guess we're most concerned about how it all fits together. When you put everything up with that, bypass it again. Yeah, it's a subtle difference, but to me, it just gets a little clearer, you know? And then I usually do, you know, a pretty high quality EQ on the overhead, same kind of thing. I'm not usually doing a much. Every overhead mic will have some kind of mid-range resonance that's, for lack of a better word, a little offensive. And so I'll pull a little bit of that out, which in this case is right around 500-ish, yeah, 425. And then I'm just doing a broad boost of only a couple of dB, yeah, 1.8 dB up at 8K. And sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. Maybe I let the EQ on the far end of the process take care of it. Room mics, let me just get to that. I think I'm running out of time here. So room mics, I've got a thing about room mics that I love to use them as much as possible. That's the one pair. This is the Coles 4038. I often do the same with these, that I really like to see the tape. I just think it softens it a little bit. You know, gives it a different kind of a low-mid push to it that I like. But really, room mics tend to like a lot of compression, at least in this genre. You know, if I was doing something cleaner or more jazzy, then I might not compress the room mics at all, just because it does tend to make things messy. Especially if you use something like, well, this Monster, or if you use maybe an SSL compressor or the Chandler, something that's really aggressive on the room mics. It's cool what it does to the mid-range, you know, 1K down, but man, it makes the top end a freaking mess. And so maybe you have this nice clear drum mix, and then you push those in, and then it all goes to hell. So my thought with that is generally a little bit of EQ to pull a little bit of top end out, just because it gets messy. So this is just one side. So you can hear how much it's grabbing. It's stupid, right? But listen how much the top end gets ratty sounding. And then just darken it up. And I put it before the compressor because sometimes we want the compressor to react what we want it to react, which to me is that low mid and the hit of the snare, not the washy crap on the cymbals, like especially here. This is no EQ. That's with the EQ. And then when you do it, of course, in stereo, again, ignore the volume. So this is no processing on the room mics. You can hear how much I'm taking away from it, but at the same time, I'm using a lot of it. Now, if I was to, let me pull this back where it was. You can hear how much just adding them in. You know, if I get rid of them, it's just a size thing completely. And same thing with these. Usually the secondary pair I'll be a little more subtle with. I don't want to destroy it as much, you know, usually. course, I say that, and then I look at this, oh, I'm destroying this one too. Sometimes I'll do that just so I have two different colors, depending. And sometimes it's like you'll have a chorus that you want to hit, so maybe you'll push the room mics in the chorus just so it gets bigger at that point, and then you can pull them all back during the verse. The mono mic is a similar thing that I'm mostly looking for kick and snare reinforcement, but it also makes things a mess. So much of this is very subjective, and the only way to fix the mess problem is to use reverb. And I don't mind using reverb per se, I just don't really ever want to hear it. And what I mean by that is that I want the reverb to sound like the room we're in, just maybe a little bit longer, and a little bit more controlled, because I can choose what I feed to the room reverb. I can't choose what I feed to the room mics. So you can hear this. That's the reverb I did. But if you just put just a little bit of it in there, I get the ambience I want without it becoming a freaking mess. Yeah, I can do a ton of that, but that sounds cheesy. Trying to avoid the cheese. But if I take it away, it just gives the snare a little more room, a little more presence, especially once you throw the rest of the band in, you know? And another thing is, it's a fair amount of ambience, but you'll notice if I just drop the bass in here, half of it's gone. See, it sounds super ambient, and then not so much. So, I guess in a nutshell, all this kind of, weird detail and things that I get in is that I'm hopefully trying to make a drum mix that sounds believable, like it's a drummer, but we took care of everything that needed to be taken care of. I don't want it to sound like, again, this is probably why I'm so, against using samples, because to me it's yes, it fixes the problem, but it's not the same anymore. Now the hits are not the same. Even if you get one that tracks dynamics, it's not the same. Every snare hit on his track is a little bit different, and that's the character. It's it's kind of the same way I feel about tuning vocals. I don't tune vocals because they sang it, and if you work on it and you get it right, then that's what they sang. And if they were done, they were done. That's why they sent it to you to mix, right? I feel the same way about drums, about guitars. I'm not opposed to fixing mistakes. I think that's the beauty of the DAW, is that when little things happen that would otherwise upset a really good track, we can fix that. And now we didn't really mess with the integrity of what was recorded, but we're presenting it like if they actually got a perfect take, there it is, or a good take. I don't want to say perfect, because perfect sucks. I'm more into, great, like greatness. I want to hear something. But all this obsession about it to me is really just about trying to present the drums in a believable way and taking care of all the problems we create by multi-micing a drum kit and getting it all to sound like we didn't multi-mic a drum kit. It's just, oh, it's drums. If I can make the listener believe, oh, I'm just listening to a band, I don't want them to notice the recording. I want them to just notice the band. If you start noticing the recording, I remember that in the early 2000s when, rock production started getting pretty crazy. And I remember hearing a song from a pretty popular artist at the time, and I didn't remember a thing about the song, but the production was really cool. And I just thought, that seems backwards. You know, why would I want to participate in that? You know, it's like you could use anybody. You know, the band doesn't matter, the song doesn't matter, the production carried the song. I would much rather just present the song in the best way possible, so people, because that's what people go see live. That's what we're here for. We're here to make people hear that band. So.
All right, thank you, Mike. I think that's all the time we have for Mike today. Big round of applause, Mr. Mike Major. If you can keep it going, another thank you to the band Madus. Thank you guys for letting us hear your track, cracking that open. And a big thank you as well to Steinberg for sponsoring this one. Thank you guys for coming.